Welcome to our first learning workshop. I hope you are all keeping well. So our first workshop is on digital identity and databases, and my colleague Venkat is going to be taking us all through the learnings. This is going to be a very interactive session. We encourage your questions at any time. So anytime you have a question, feel free either to type in the chat box or just to raise your hand, and we'll allow you to ask a question. So the first 45 minutes, we'll use them to make a presentation, interrupt us at any time. After that, we'll get into our action planning session, where we'll really require your feedback on the presentation, as well as any additional comments that you may have on the way forward for Kdsg. So welcome to the session. Thank you.
My name is Venkat Goli. I'm the Chief Architect at Microsafe. I work with a lot of things on the technology realm, but a lot of the work that I do is around digital ID and databases. In this session, we want to give you a flavor of digital ID and how Kaduna State could benefit from the digital ID and database. Can you go to the next slide, please? The agenda for today is roughly pieces. One is 45 minutes of where we quickly run through a presentation on some of the key concepts, and another 45 minutes is for the action plan on Kaduna. Can we go to the next slide? Just before we start the workshop, I just wanted to touch on a few key ideas and thoughts, and I wanted this to just lay on some of the thoughts when we're going through an ID. A lot of times, ID is thought upon as this silver bullet, right? It comes, solves all problems. That's not the way ID should be looked at. It's not core to an interoperable payment system. Our end goal is for Kaduna is to build an interoperable real-time digital payment system. ID is one of the enabling elements, but it's not it's not the only element or the only enabling element. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. If we feel that ID is constraining us for some reason, work on the payment system should continue. Even if a digital ID system is being developed or built in parallel, this should continue to happen. So these are the two thoughts I would like to see with you all while this presentation goes on. 3 and 4 are more I'm just hoping that a lot of you had some time to read the pre-read material, and I'm just going to go with that leap of faith. But if you haven't, and if you want to ask some questions, please feel free to do that, and I'll be more than happy to sort of help you. So this, and as much as possible, this presentation will be shared with you, so don't worry, no need to take notes, screenshots, etc. This is available for you. This is your material. Can we go to the next slide, please? So let's start with the big picture. Next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide? So if I was to look at ID and what are the things? Again, if I was to build this into an interoperable payment system, then there are about 4 components that we're looking at. One is a biometric ID infrastructure. This could be central, this could be decentralized, but some basic ID infrastructure is one element of an interoperable payment system. The second is the core payment infrastructure. And this core payment infrastructure can be public finance management systems, the banking systems, the actual payment systems which transfer out the money, and all other elements. Number 3 is the authentication infrastructure, and that authentication infrastructure includes the last mile authentication that is required for ID to be used. So, you'll see a lot of these handheld devices or POS devices, which are the end mile authentication infrastructure. And fourth is the program infrastructure or the database systems that we call it. So let us say line department has a program or a scheme, then that particular program database is as important as anything else. So tomorrow, if I want to do a wage subsidy program, tomorrow, if I want to give health benefits, tomorrow, if I want to give a program to farmers in agriculture, the program MIS or database is just about important. Now, all these four elements talk to each other. 1 and 3 are more similar. They're ID systems. 2 is the public finance management system and the banking systems. And number 4 is basically the what I would call as the database or the program system where actually the beneficiaries are enrolled, their entitlements are calculated and captured, and then it moves on. Can we go to the next slide? Now, each of these have their own flavor. So for example, if I was to look at a biometric enabled digital ID system, there are certain key decisions that I need to make. Is it a foundation ID? Is it a function ID? What are the technologies that I need to use? Do I want to use fingerprint? Do I want to use face? Do I want to use iris? Do I want to use all three? What are the exception handling mechanisms that I can use? Because not always will your biometrics work. If they don't work, what can I do? Should I use a card-based or should I use a number-based? And finally, will authentication happen at a centralized mechanism or through a more localized infrastructure? We'll delve into these a little more in detail slightly later. So, so just keep these at the back of your mind when you are when we sort of delving into other aspects. The base scenario, the minimum that you'll get is a paper-based ID, and whatever is built on top of that is additional elements with respect to biometrics, etc. Can we go to the next slide, please? In payment infrastructure, there are two aspects that we need to talk about. One is public finance management systems, and one is the banking and payment infrastructure. When I say public finance management systems, what I'm talking about is state treasury systems, state IFMIS systems, what we call as financial management information systems that are that the government uses to as its financial asset, financial transactions are managed out there. So how it does its budgeting, how it does its expenditure, how it does its revenue, how it does debt management, all of those come under public finance management systems. Banking and payment infrastructure is how that money is transferred either between government systems or from government systems to businesses, or government systems to people, and for wages or for salaries or for any other benefit programs that the government has done. So this is actually the second component. Again, in payment infrastructure, the bare minimum that people will do is, yes, why don't we just give cash, right? So that's the base scenario. What we build on top is what we're trying to do at Kaduna. How can I use digital payments? How can I do digital transactions? How can I use e-money as a concept? Again, there is various levels of control, but in general, we anyway have a separate session on this, so I don't want to get too much into detail. Can we move on, please? Component 4, a critical one that we usually miss, is the program database. What does a program database entail? There are two elements that it entails. And this is basically around what I would call as observability and eligibility. So when I make a decision to pay, I should be in a position to say that this person is eligible. How do I calculate eligibility is something that the program system does. So if I'm a government employee, I will need to know that he's attended office, for the 30 days based on whatever protocol it is. If I need to pay a health worker, I need to know that the health worker did the tasks that were allocated to her. So the program database is a very critical element where three things get done. One is eligibility gets defined, eligibility gets computed and checked, and observability and the actual decision to pay is made out here. So once the decision to pay is made, then the banking infrastructure and the payment systems start to take over for the actual payment to reach the last mile. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, having talked about all of this, I wanted to spend a quick few minutes on how India basically has sort of doing this. In India, there are three large programs that exist as far as G2P or with respect to social benefits are concerned. One is the food program. The food program roughly targets about 800 million people and is done with an annual outlay of about 25 billion US dollars. The fuel program, where we give LPG or liquefied petroleum gas cylinders to beneficiaries, targets about 276 million people. And it's about a program that costs about $5 billion to the exchequer. And the fertilizer program, so the 3 Fs of food, fuel, and fertilizer, is for farmers, where again, about $11 billion is provided in subsidized fertilizer in the form of urea and other elements to about 85 million farmers in the country. Each of these, if you see, has a common set of issues. In food, it is misappropriation of stock quality and fake or duplicate eligibility cards. So you have a card, and this is a functional card. It's not and this functional card basically says each family is entitled to a particular amount of food grain. Now, if I create a fake or a duplicate card, then I'm eligible for this food benefit. In fuel, again, the creation of duplicate or fake beneficiaries, again, is one of the issues. And in fertilizer, the problem is that urea, which is used as a fertilizer, can also be diverted for industrial use. So it's used for other chemicals and becomes the input for other chemicals as well. Now, all of these three, the common element where ID came into the picture was for the fake duplication to ensure that the diversion for industrial use and other purposes does not happen. So in a way, weeding out of ghost beneficiaries, ensuring that fake or duplicate cards are weeded out, and ensuring that only those who are actually eligible for the program are actually those who are doing it, is how the ID program in India actually sort of came in and then sort of streamlined all these. Now, all of these things did not wait for ID. The food system happened before ID came in. The fuel program was there even before ID came in. Fertilizer also was there before ID came in. What ID did was streamline these programs to ensure that accurately, wisely, and to the people who deserved it. Can we go to the next slide, please? If you look at it, what are the 4 things that we required or needed to be done? First was database digitization. So, we in food, fuel, or fertilizer, we needed to create a database of beneficiaries of food, of fuel, or of fertilizers or farmers. Then we linked it to our ID system. India's ID system is called Aadhaar, and that linkage has allowed for something which is called as deduplication. So about 30 million fake food cards, 45 million fake gas connections, and about 12 million metric tons of fertilizer, which used to get diverted, got saved because of ID. So the program ran for a long time before ID. There were inefficiencies. ID came in, stepped in, and solved those inefficiencies. How did that get done? So it was not just about technology as far as ID was concerned. Technology was also used in the digitization of databases, using of POS systems or point of sale devices, additional GPS tracking for food. So all of these were additional use of technology that also took place. And the last bit is the movement away from cash to an actual bank account based transfer. So earlier, if money for a social benefit was being given via direct cash, this was what we call in India as direct benefit transfer. It's also globally called as G2P, and that was the that was the fourth thing that got done as a part of this transformation in India, which sort of saw significant benefits for the government as well as the end user. Can we move on, please? So obviously we said transparency or observability, as we call it, government savings, the onboarding of beneficiaries, and the prevention of leakages. So these were the key elements of how the Aadhaar or the ID program in India came in and helped solve the problem. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Now, what are the lessons that we learned from India? If I was to catalyze and say, tell me the top three things, it would be, first is, journey of digitization is not about identity alone. It is about building program systems and databases that are critical for digital transformation. ID obviously helps, and ID is a key differentiator, as you've seen in the case of India with respect to transparency, observability, fraud, and also in case of efficiency. In India, what happened was most systems came together parallelly. There was no hard dependency that we are going to wait till system X gets done or system Y gets done. Now, that has its own issues and problems, because at times you have to go back and correct things, reinvent the wheel slightly, make changes, and do an additional onboarding process, which at times is suboptimal. But if you're looking at beneficiaries and beneficiary management from that perspective, it may make sense for us to actually do a lot of these things in parallel. So if I was to build a payment system or a payment infrastructure for Kaduna, would I wait for ID, or would I build those systems in and say that those critical use cases which have ID will get onboarded the moment we actually have the digital ID system in place? And finally, the true value and power of digital transformation journey is realized when all these systems come together and work together cohesively. In India, we call it JAM. The bank account or the Jandan, which is basically nothing but people's money or the bank accounts. A is for Aadhaar and M is for mobile. So the JAM trinity coming together is when India realized the true potential of ID and the other systems that come into play. Can we move to the next slide, please? Now, can you just go back one slide, Nancy? Before I come, I just wanted to stop out here and just take a moment to see how the room's feeling. Is this okay so far? Are there any questions? Would anybody like to stop me here, or should I continue? So, Nancy, maybe we should continue then. Can you go to the next slide, please, then? So, having read the pre-read documents, I wanted us to quickly just delve on a few core concepts of foundation ID and functional ID, and other core concepts as far as ID is concerned. So I'll try and do this over the next. So we've done about 30 minutes of time so far. So the next 15 to 20 minutes, we'll try and basically focus on this. Next slide, please, Nancy. So this is a slide that you had on your pre-read, and I just wanted to sort of reiterate that the reason why we call systems, especially digital ID systems, such as India's Aadhaar or any other system, even the NID of Nigeria, the particular reason. I have a driving license. It is used for a particular reason, that is to drive a car. I have a tax ID, it is for me to file my taxes. A foundation ID per se is not a special purpose identity. The only, if I was to look at core ID principles, for me, the only reason why I would need a foundation ID is for one core reason, and that is to ascertain that the reason, or to ascertain that a person who is claiming to be who he is, and that is fundamentally what an ID, a foundation ID system is. A foundation ID will not be a proxy for citizenship, will not be a proxy for driver's license or driving, will not be a proxy for any other program related functional ID system that is issued. The idea of a foundation ID is just one thing. If a person X comes and claims to say he is person X, a foundation ID will ascertain the fact that the person who he is claiming to be is the person that he is. Everything else is additional, is good to have, but this for me is the core reason why we call these foundation IDs as foundation IDs. It is just to ascertain whether the person who's claiming to be is the person or not. How is that done? That is done basically because you have biometrics, and biometrics are something that are unique to that particular person. Can you move to the next slide, please? Now, in this particular case, we have roughly about 3 IDs that are there. And I don't want to call all of them, I'm calling these as loosely as IDs. We have the NIN, we have the BVN, and we have the Kaduna State Residency card. Now, each one of them, if you look at it, has a set of principles, or has been built on a set of design principles. And those design principles are something that, that when we go through the next slides, we will start to look at it and tie it back to your pre-read, which is the World Bank's principles, the 10 principles that they have come out with, and that have been further built on by us, with specific elements. So let's start with the NID, the NIN, or the EID as we call it. Nancy, can you go to the next slide, please? So this is an ID that exists for everybody. It's a smart card, it's an electronic chip. It's random in nature, it's given for people above 16 years of age. But if I was to look at it from a core element, one of the things that we would, which is worth discussing, is why is it random? The idea of a random ID is something that is a very strong and powerful principle that should continue to be used and should continue to be reinforced. A lot of times when we go to new countries that want to implement an ID program, they always suggest, can we have an ID which is which has a pattern? So say, for example, first 4 digits would represent the state. The next 2 digits would be the district or province. The third digit would be, the next digits would be, the city, and then the locality, and then the house number. The reason why a random ID is extremely powerful is because of the intrinsic privacy that it brings and the element of profiling that it totally eliminates. So tomorrow, if, let's say, for example, in India, if it was not random, and if it was, if it had this pattern, tomorrow, if a government came to power and it felt that a particular province did not vote for them, let us say, and they felt that as a result, they should not be given, the people of that particular province or area should not be given benefits, I could use the ID to sort of then build in a kind of a logic which then can be used for actually transfers such as social transfers. Now, the randomization in that basically provides that power. Similarly, in some of the World Bank principles, if you see, you will notice that there's a conversation about inclusion, and it tries to basically say that IDs which are rolled out should basically be pretty much from almost at the time of birth to death. So the entire life cycle of a person should be governed by an ID. Now, once we have stronger civil registration systems and we have a more better way of digitizing our birth certificates, then this could also start to lead into, or start to feed into the national ID database that exists within NIMSI. Can you move on to the next slide? Similarly, with respect to a BVN number, in fact, one of the things that was surprising was that, the number of BVN, the people with the BVN number seem to be more than the people with an ID. And that is something that, that at least to start off with is natural, but over a period of time, as foundation IDs start to gain credence, start to gain acceptance, and start to be used, the NIMSI related ID or the NIN will start to gain more traction and more acceptability and start to have a larger reach as well. Can you move to the next slide, please? Again, do I consider the Kaduna State Residency Card Program a function ID or a foundation ID? And this is something that we've internally also been discussing. And the reason being, if I have to go by the original definition that we said, that a foundation ID does not give you any functional, it does not implement any functional use case, but it just sort of specifies or identifies whether the person who's claiming to be who he is the person who he is. In that case, the Kaduna State Residency Card Program is actually a foundation ID also. At the same time, the fact that you're planning to use it as a debit card for financial transactions, you could argue that it's a functional ID. But fundamentally, the way it's structured, the way it is, the Kaduna State, the residency card would qualify actually as a foundation ID. Can you move to the next slide, please? Now, there's been a lot of questions on how do we do, how should ID systems, what is the infrastructure that the ID system should use? What kind of a credential should we have? Should we have a plain paper or no paper or just a number, like say maybe India, which has plain paper and just a number? Or do we have a smart card based approach? And we've, with my own experience of advising two countries, which is India and Indonesia, and both of them use two separate ways of approaching the problem, I tried to bring out the nuances as far as these two approaches are concerned. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, let's look at Indonesia and India. Indonesia has a smart card. So it has a card where your ID credentials, that is your biometrics, are stored within the card. It's stored in a chip. It is quite secure. It is issued to every person, and that person can basically use this particular smart card. India, on the other hand, just gives you a dummy paper card. In fact, you don't even need the card. All you need to do is remember your number. So even if you go and just write down your number in a piece of paper and you carry that piece of paper along, that is good enough. Now, what are the differences? In Indonesia, the last mile authentication infrastructure needs to be stronger and more expensive because of this design choice. Why do we say this? How does authentication happen in Indonesia? In Indonesia, you have a smart card reader which reads the smart card and takes the ID credentials, the biometric ID credentials from the smart card, and then basically authenticates it with the person who swipes his ID, his thumbprint, his fingerprint on that particular device. So authentication is happening on the smart card itself. In India, the authentication device is nothing but a relayer. It just transmits information back to the central repository, and authentication is done on the central repository. So the minutiae or the biometric that you've captured is not being authenticated on the device. It's going all the way back to the central repository, then coming back with a yes, no, saying that, this particular person is the person it claims to be. In Indonesia, that is happening on the local infrastructure itself. How does these two, now let's look at the geographical nature of these two countries. India is a landmass, is a large landmass of multiple languages, etc., all of those things, but fundamentally does not have challenges. There are challenges of terrain, etc., but fundamentally connectivity, etc., is not such a big issue. Indonesia, on the other hand, is an archipelago of about 3,000 islands. If I was to basically have a more predictable internet connectivity systems in place, the challenges that could come out of that could be quite significant. And therefore, localized authentication infrastructure makes more sense in the case of Indonesia. The added advantage from that, yes, I will repeat that, Joy. Just give me a minute. I'll just finish this point and then I will repeat the authentication infrastructure. The offline mechanism, when I say an offline mechanism, what I'm trying to say is your authentication process does not need to go back to the main server. It is being done on the local card device itself. What that means is that you don't need to be dependent on predictable internet connectivity for authentication to happen. So with Indonesia, again, if I was to repeat, what happens is you have a POS device, a point of sale device, or a smart card reader. And this smart card reader does two things. I first swipe in the card. So I have a smart card. So I'm basically a resident of Indonesia. I have a smart card with me. In my smart card, my ID credentials are embedded in it. So when I go to the smart card reader, what happens is the person who's authenticating me first swipes my smart card against the smart card reader. Once he swipes it, the smart card reader reads the authentication, the ID credentials that are stored within the smart card reader. I am next asked to authenticate myself using my fingerprint. So when I put my fingerprint on the panel of the smart card reader, the panel reads my ID, my fingerprint or thumbprint, and then checks against these two. So it checks against what the smart card reader stores and what has been put on the panel. And it is a local check that is happening on the smart card device itself. In the case of India, that is not the case. The smart card reader is not actually smart. You can just have a plain mobile application which just reads the fingerprint, because the role of the end mile infrastructure in India is not to do authentication, but as a relaying service. It relays the information back to the central repository. In the central repository, authentication happens, and then a yes-no comes back. In the case of Indonesia, the yes-no happens locally on the smart card reader. As a result, these two systems have their own pros and cons. I can say to a certain extent, Indonesia is not as tamper-proof because the credentials that are stored on the card could be tampered with, though it is quite difficult because there is a lot of technology that has gone into having stronger credentials as far as smart cards are concerned. But the advantage of an Indonesia model, as we said, is that you will actually be able to do offline authentication without the dependence on connectivity. Whereas India, connectivity is a big deal, and therefore India had to work overtime to ensure that its connectivity infrastructure was significantly enhanced. So one of the problems that we do still continue to face is the morning 10 a.m. problem, as we call it in India, or the 9:30 to 10 a.m. problem, where every single government employee who's working in government offices in India comes and authenticates themselves on the attendance system, which is done on the ID system. So that particular ID, the fingerprint is recorded, transmitted back to the ID repository, the central system, and then the response comes back. So in India, in general, most G2P programs or social benefit programs are advised not to do authentication between 9:30 and 10:30. Let the government employees finish their authentication, and then this particular activity is done at a later stage. So this is one of the nuances that we wanted to bring about versus the smart card and the plain number approach that India basically follows. Joy, does that work? You had asked this question, if I could repeat it. Was I clear? Was it helpful?
Yes, it was very clear, and thank you.
Thank you. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, one of the key elements that I wanted to talk about was obviously on eKYC, and I think this is pretty much the last bit of the thing, because we want to get into the actioning element as well, and that's a critical element as far as the role of this particular workshop is concerned. Now, when I try and basically, why am I saying eKYC? One of the things that we've noticed is there is a direct correlation between simplification of KYC and financial inclusion. There are no two ways about it. This is a fact. Now, if I want to simplify KYC, there is a set of things that I need to do. And some of these are process-based, right? I need to get better processes in place. I need to sort of have a tiered KYC model, all of those things. But eKYC is a very powerful tool that is used, as far as financial inclusion is concerned. How does India do it? India has two APIs, as we call it, application programming interfaces, that sit along with Aadhaar. So the ID system that is there exposes two APIs. Just like NIMSI also exposes an API for verification. Similarly, these two APIs are what we call as POI, proof of identity and proof of address. So if a particular user authenticates themselves, eKYC does two things. It first gives a yes, no. It says whether the person is claiming to be the person he is, right? So what do I do in India? I enter my 12-digit ID, and then I enter my thumbprint. And when my thumbprint is entered and my 12-digit ID is entered, it does a check on the central repository and checks if these both match. That is, in the central repository, against that 12-digit ID, is this the minutiae, or is this basically the fingerprints that are captured? Once that is done, I get back a yes or a no. Now, for financial inclusion and for FATF reasons, etc., proof of identity is not the only thing. A proof of address or additional documents are also asked. Now, because the ID system already has the address and address proof details, the second API that is exposed is basically nothing but what we call as a POA, a proof of address API that returns that particular person's address in a form. Now, that address that the system gives back is verified against the document that is provided at the time of onboarding.
Hope we are all enjoying the session this far. So our first question is, what is the key challenge we are facing with developing digital ID and databases in Kdsg? So we'll just ask you to give us the option that you think is the correct one. So the first option is clarity on the benefits of digital ID. The second one is stakeholder buy-in. And the third one is coordination and collaboration among stakeholders.
Can take a few minutes to respond to that question before we go to the next one. If we can give it 2-3 minutes, thank you very much. You can see that coming in. We'll give it 2 more minutes, and then Nancy, maybe you can just quickly talk through the 4 questions and see which is getting, which questions are, what options are leaning more for each particular question that we've asked. Just 2 more minutes for anyone who has yet to complete. All right, thank you very much. So Nancy, can you see the responses to the first question? What is the key challenge we are facing with developing digital ID and databases in Kdsg?
I think you'll have to check on your end.
Okay, now I can read them out and maybe you can just make a comment, and Noop also, maybe you can feel free to come in with a comment or two. So we have at 33% clarity on the benefits of digital ID. Then we have a small percentage of our audience who at 15% who feel it's stakeholder buy-in. And then the larger percentage to this question have answered that it's a coordination and collaboration amongst stakeholders. Maybe Nancy or Anoop, maybe you'd like to say something around this topic. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Doreen. So I think that is what we also gathered in our digital readiness assessment, that the synchronization and the harmonization between the different entities is perhaps what is leading to the issues around identity, the digital identity and databases in Kdsg, plus also the whole aspect around developing like who should be responsible to develop the digital ID and how it should be coordinated. Maybe here, if I may invite Mr. Lawal to comment on this question and the feedback that we have received. Sir, may I request you to respond to this, sir?
He's on mute. Maybe he can just unmute himself. Mr. Lawal, you can just unmute himself.
Yes. Hello.
Yes, sir. We can hear you, sir.
Thank you.
So the question was, what is the key challenge we are facing with developing digital ID and databases in Kdsg? And a large number of people have responded as coordination and collaboration among stakeholders. So any comment on this, sir?
No, I think it's just resources. It's a question of resources that we're deploying to capture the data and issue the cards. We are scaling up now to be able to do more. I don't believe there's any major challenge per se. It's just that it's expensive, and we're doing it along with the budget that we can provide for it. Thank you.
Sure, sir. Thank you so much.
I will read out the second question, which says, which of these ID types is a foundational ID? So the smaller percentage of our participants have responded BVN, which is at 24%. Then 59% of the participants have said it is NIMC. And then 48% have talked about Kaduna State Residency Card. Maybe there's a comment around this. Anyone, maybe Anup or Venkat, or maybe one of the participants would like to touch on this.
Maybe Venkat, would you want to talk about the foundational versus functional?
So as we said, I think the BVN, as he said, is a function. It has a very specific function, and that is basically to operate or to allow you. So when you go to open your account, you're given this BVN number. But does having a BVN answer the question of what a foundation ID aims to do, which is foundation ID basically ascertains whether the person is actually the person who is claiming to be is. Now for BVN, that's not even the aim of the BVN. The BVN is basically allows you. So when you go and open a bank account, you're probably given a BVN, and all your bank accounts are linked to that particular BVN. So it's a very specific function for a banking perspective. And as you said, the NIMC is more a foundation ID, which forms as the core to establish that particular thing about ascertaining the identity of a person, or proof of identity, as we call it.
Okay, thank you for that, Venkat. We'll hand over the session back to you so that you can continue from where we left. Thank you.
So as we were saying, the eKYC that we're looking at, there's a lack of KYC standards, authenticity of documents.
But sorry, he hasn't said anything.
See? Please go ahead, if you could comment.
I think what he was trying to say was that you touched a little bit about the BVN as a functional ID, but you haven't really said anything about the Kaduna Resident Registration Agency card, either as a functional or as a foundational ID.
He did. Oh. He said that during the presentation. It's a foundational ID.
During the presentation, I had touched upon it. From my understanding, the Kaduna State Residency Card is something that is issued in collaboration with NIMC, and as a result, the fundamental aim of this is to ascertain whether the person who is claiming to be is the person he is. All other elements now. It's being used for multiple purposes, but those are but fundamentally it is to establish proof of identity. Now, one of the things that we did see is that it could also act as a debit card in the future, right? That could make it functional, but fundamentally it's a foundation ID. This is something that is happening also in the case of India, where the PAN card, which is the tax ID that we have, is slowly starting to get deprioritized, and the ID that we have, the national ID that we have, is also can be quoted. To basically say that for me, the Kaduna State Residency card is a foundation ID because it serves the fundamental purpose is to establish proof of identity. And any additional things that it basically does is additional responsibilities that are given to it because of the wide prevalence of the card, like in India, where the ID, our digital ID, Aadhaar, has slowly started to replace some of the functional IDs, for example, the tax number. I'll stop here. I think somebody else wanted to make a point.
No, I think I just wanted to say that it's obvious at this point that a lot of these IDs are both functional and foundational at the same time.
I think that's a fair observation. What we would like to essentially try and the reason why we try to establish something as a foundation ID is to ensure that critical activities that are expensive and time consuming don't happen multiple times. For example, the collection of biometric ID. That is time taking and time consuming. And the foundation, by establishing one foundation ID, the principle of collection of this information is done only once. Other systems that are using it, especially government systems, could use it based on the rules and regulations that NIMC comes up with. And that's fundamentally one of the reasons why the discussion around foundation ID also tends to be more around what does it collect and what should it have. A lot of foundation IDs should not have, for example, in my view, should not collect blood groups or should not collect any other information apart from just about 8 to 10 fields, and those should be name, age, sex, age or date of birth, address, parents, father's name, mother's name, and maybe a few other details. But apart from that, any other information such as bank account details or anything else should not be captured as a part of the system. Now, there's a difference between providing that as proof of, when you're going to enroll for your NIMC, you could go with a set of IDs that are prescribed. That does not necessarily mean all that data is entered into the NID database and sort of captured out there. So the amount of information that is captured should be as minimal as possible. And these are principles that have the good ID says that the World Bank's principles try and say that privacy by design is a critical element, and as little information should be captured as possible. Now, the same principles may not apply for a functional ID. When I'm going to collect my driver's license, I would like to know also my blood group and additional aspects, because those could be important in critical circumstances, when there's an accident or something like that.
So Venkat.
Yes, please.
So do you just see it as a design flaw or an issue if you try to enrich the foundational data with more than 10 fields?
Functional data can be enriched as much as possible. Foundation data enrichment is a two-edged sword. There are advantages, and I'd be the first one to admit it. But a better way to do that could be to have stronger program systems. So, for example, if I'm trying to do certain activity for the agriculture supply chain, I would rather have a farmer's database which is separate, which calculates, which collects additional information. So the farmer's database or the farmer's registry could contain the name of the farmer, the details, etc. It could have the NID, the national ID linked to it in some virtual form, so not in some anonymized or randomized form, but could have an additional 10 fields that are required, like, what is the amount of land that the farmer owns, whether the farmer owns mechanized tools like a tractor or something else, whether the farmer owns, what is the crop that he grows, what is the, where he sells it. So all this additional information can actually go into the program systems, as we call it. And enriching the foundation ID may be an easy way out, but I would, based on at least the India experience and a few other experiences, I would suggest that that is something that should basically fall in the functional ID or the program system. The program MIS should actually sort of try and do that.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that was clear.
Yes, just to a significant extent, yes. But you said it was a double-edged sword, so what's the other edge?
See, the double-edged is obviously now the central repository of my, the thing is that when I collect, data collection is tedious, time-taking, painful. Now, if I'm saying I'm collecting 10 things, why don't I collect instead of 10 things, 20 things or 25 things? So from an ease perspective, if I'm starting a new program or if I'm starting a foundation ID program, there is an inclination to collect a lot more information. Whereas that may not actually be the advisable way. So when I say double-edged sword, you will see benefits in the sense that when you collect 25 fields, you're doing it all at one shot. And therefore you may say that from a short-term perspective, yes, I instead of collecting 10 fields, I did collect 25 fields because I was anyway going out there to collect 10 fields. But the better way obviously for that to do is that additional 15 fields, move it to a program database, link the NID with that program database, and then ensure that benefits, etc., are driven based on checking the NID with the APIs that NIMC provides, and then sort of go about doing the benefits. So in this way, you'll have the power of the ID system through deduplication and all those aspects, but at the same time, you're ensuring that your foundation ID is fairly key and core and is not oversaddled with additional information. These 15 fields also, you will notice, change all the time. A farmer will buy new tracts of land, will change new tracts of land, will buy a tractor, will do a number of things. Those need to continuously be updated. Whereas a date of birth will not change unless it was a mistake in the beginning. Your sex will not change unless there is a need for you to do that based on how you feel with respect to your own identity. But otherwise, or your name it's very rarely that those things change. Whereas, the program related elements change all the time. So you need to also have a more robust way of updating your systems. And therefore, keeping them in the program database could be a more advisable way of going about things.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's a double-edged sword. You save money if you try to collect all the information in one go, you save time. But ultimately, when those variables change, they're going to hurt you. When the farmer moves from one location to another and acquires a bigger site, a bigger farmland, the ID remains, but the functional information to do with farm has changed, and your database is no longer accurate. Whereas if you focus on the foundational ID data, the 10 data, those will be more or less infallible over time, and they remain consistent for as long as the person is alive. But the things that change, it's better to have them in a different folder and then alter them. But you cannot change date of birth, you cannot change name, and so on and so forth, a national ID number. This is why it's better to separate and why it's a double-edged sword. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. If there are any other questions, or I'll just quickly run through one or two more slides, and then we get to the some elements of the action plan that we've tried to create to spur your thoughts.
This is the Accountant General. I have a question based on what SAC said.
Please go ahead.
This identification, I was thinking that because of modern technology and ability to do things offline, if there are changes going forward, shouldn't the ID owner have access to be able to do that change? So what I mean is, there should be a free field for you to be able to update your address, update whatever information that cannot be changed. Of course, date of birth you can't change. Things that are very vital you cannot change. But if it's in terms of where you are at any point in time, isn't the technology going to make that easy for the ID owner to be able to do that anyway? Thank you.
I think that was that's an excellent point that was brought up as to how do I manage change even in a foundation ID system. Now let's and I'll try and use an illustrative example. In India, for example, ID you can be as young as 3 years old, I think, when you can start to get issued an ID. Now, when you're 2 or 3, some of your ID prints, etc., do not get are not as well formed. So they just take a picture of the baby, and they take a picture of the mother. Now, when the child attains an age of 15 or 18, there is a need. Now, you can continuously update your information, but it's mandated that once you've attained an age, which is about 15 or 18, you need to update it with your own credentials. Now, there is a change management process in place. It is also advisable in general, and it's advised that people update their iris and their fingerprints from time to time, because of wear and tear or because of occupational reasons. People may need to sort of continue to update their information, and you absolutely need a change management process to do that. Now, the point that we're trying to bring is some of these are more controllable change. So when I'm updating my foundation ID, I would not need to deploy the number of people, staff, etc., that I need to deploy, and the regions where I need to deploy could be slightly more compact. Teams could be compact if we have a set of fields which are more or less likely to remain the same. That does not mean we should not have a change management process. All we are saying is that the change management process is slightly more controlled when the fields are better, and functional fields such as the examples that we brought out could be actually managed. Now, you could ask me, things like blood groups, etc., also do not change. So can we not have all things which are unlikely to change into this particular ID? Now, these are design elements. The idea is to say minimal data collection, because the lesser data you have, the more chances of you protecting that system as well better. If there is, God forbid, a threat or some kind of a leak or something that happens, then you're able to, in a way, the data that is lost is fairly lesser compared to what is there. We also typically, when we go into more advanced stages of discussion, we also suggest you keep the information and so we call it two databases. In fact, we call it the biometric database and we call it the identity database. So the information fields are kept separately and the biometric information is kept separately in two separate databases, and there is a common virtual linkage. And this will further help, in the terms of data breaches, etc., that are happening. So modern technologies obviously allow us to do it. Processing and compute power allow us to do it, and therefore there is a chance to sort of leverage all of this. But the idea of collecting as minimal data as possible for a foundation ID is something that we generally tend to try and basically advocate. And it's just not us. A lot of groups tend to advocate these. So Nancy, if you could just go to the next slide. So we were talking about KYC and why KYC is important for ID. I just wanted to spend some time on what is required for eKYC. So obviously you need the digital ID. You need some infrastructure readiness, right? You need endpoint infrastructure, like, as you said, the card readers or the biometric devices and all of that. You need support systems in place. And this is an area that we've been, that I think is something that we usually tend to miss. So the program systems are MISs for health, the MIS for farmers, the MIS for other food beneficiaries. All of those also need to be digitized. That is only when, an eKYC-like program can actually help. So why does eKYC really work in banks? eKYC works in banks because banks already have that, the support systems already in place. They have robust systems where you can capture, onboard, easily do all those things. Now, when you link it with the power of eKYC, then it's easier for you to onboard. So instead of going physically on the field and verifying, whether the address of the person is right, etc., you could use the digital ID's address and use proof of identity and proof of address APIs that provide to sort of to create this. Last but not the least, the regulation that is there. Enabling regulation is something that that has taken a while to get it right, and we have struggled actually to get it right. We've had the Supreme Court sort of strike down some elements, and then those had to be sort of curated back in a way that actually made sense. So regulation is something that is also key to a success of an eKYC program. Can you go to the next few slides? I think we skipped the next few slides because they are more just case studies of how eKYC was used in various countries. You anyway are going to have this slide deck with you. So I'll quickly jump to the action plan. And we'll start with a typical payment grid. Nancy, can you go to the next slide, please? Now, when payments are being made, there's a payer, there's a payee, there's government, there's business, there's person. And each of this grid has a certain type of payments that are made. Government to government is more, budgetary allocations. Government to business could be refunds. Business to government could be taxes, and so on. Based on a visioning exercise with you, can you go to the next slide, Nancy? These are the use cases that we had prioritized, right? So we had said government salaries and wages, agriculture value chain, cash transfers and social payments, cash in and cash out. These are some of the elements of what we call as that we should consider to actionize ASAP. And I think this was submitted as a part of the vision document that all of you would have had access to. Can we go to the next slide? Now, if I was to think of it that way, that yes, these are the use cases. Let's say, for example, government salaries and wages. Now, if I want to basically sort of move that to a G2P payment system as a use case, what do I need to do? I need to enroll the government workers. So I have some program system somewhere which says, okay, these are the employees. So that's typically an HRMS, an HR management or personal management system, which basically contains all the list of government people. Now, that system already exists. Now, the additional elements that I need to do is I need to check for proof of work before I make payments. So I assign work and then I check for proof of work. So for a health worker, assigning work could be, please go and immunize people, or please go and inoculate people in a vaccination program. For a government person, the assignment of work could be, do your day-to-day work. But you also need a proof of work for something like that. You need to be able to ascertain and say that, yes, the person who I've assigned this work has actually done that work. Only then will I make that payment. So in the case of a government worker, it could be the fact that he was in office is a proxy for proof of work. It could be a proxy for assignment of work as well. So having a database of government people, government employees, having a way in which I can ascertain proof of work, that is that they did work, are precursors before I make my payment. Now, currently, my payment could be made based on, again, an online attendance system, or it could be a register where it is entered. Whatever be the mechanism, at the end of the month, that is verified, and then that payment is made. And then finally, the withdrawal of that payment and how that payment is basically used further. So whether it's taken from a Kiko agent, whether it's taken from a bank, or whether you just get cash on hand. So these are some multiple ways in which you can get that. And then how can I track that usage as well? Could be some of the key things that we may have to think about when we're thinking about the use case for government salaries and wages. Similarly, for cash transfer and social payments, I could still use the same. I will enroll a beneficiary for a social program. I may not assign them work because here there is no assignment of work. There is no proof of work that is required because I've enrolled, and at the time of enrollment, I am checking whether they're eligible or not, right? And then I'm basically making that particular payment, and then that payment gets withdrawn and that money gets used. And this could be, a framework for actually trying to see how we can prioritize use cases, for our Kaduna program. So, yes, sir.
Please, let me just take you back to the first one, which is mindful of the fact that we already have payroll systems. But let's say in the health sector, we contemplate bringing in, when you talk about proof of work, have to interface like an attendance registry, attendance management system. Would that suffice as proof of work?
So my point is this: we do not want to add new proofs of work. If there is a proof of work that you use, my question would be: is it digitized? If it is digitized, let's use that, because that is how currently you make your payments to your health workers. If that is not digitized and that is let's say a physical registry, can we figure out a way in which that can be digitized so that I can quickly ping that digital system. I can check in that digital system, see, and then make that payment, and use the Kaduna interoperable payment system that we're building out to make that payment.
That's what I'm saying, that we don't have one right now that is digitized, but I'm saying that if you have your attendance system where you do a fingerprint, even though that's under question now because of COVID, and that can be interfaced with the system, with the ID system and the program, which is the payroll. Is that what you mean?
Yes, correct. So it could be an ID where we use a fingerprint, or there could be other ways as well. Right now, from what I'm understanding from what you're saying, sir, is your current system is on a physical register. Am I right?
Yes, more or less.
And each office has its own physical register.
Yes.
So let's say, for example, each department will have it, and that department head checks whether the person was available for the working days that they're supposed to be, and then payment is made based on that. Now, that needs to be digitized, and that's, for me, that could be as important, if not more, than the digital ID system. Now, in this particular case of proof of work, what we are saying is we could use the ID system. But if we are not using the ID system, can I digitize the physical register on a daily basis? So if the attendance is entered into a physical register, at the end of the day, can I just put it into a physical system, into a digital system? It need not even be that we need to use a digital ID platform for it. I hope
Okay.
I'm making sense. What I'm trying to say is, let's not wait for the ID. If there is a way of actually getting first order benefits, and first order benefits is just moving the register from the physical form to an online form by even manually entering it on a day-to-day basis. In that department, if that can be done, then our first aspect of government payments could be digitized ASAP. So can we go back to the use case slide, Nancy? Slide number 30. No, I don't think, I think let's not get into the pre-read now. I think let's give some time for one slide before this, please. So this is, Anup, from what I recall, this is what we have presented as a part of our phase 1, right?
Yeah, that is right.
And therefore, our approach should be as to what are the quick wins in phase 1. Yes, there could be dependencies on ID, but if ID is if we have to wait for the ID, then let's not wait for the ID. Let's look at creative ways in which each of these can be, where the use cases can be built without the ID, and the ID related efficiencies can be brought in later as well. In this case, let's take the example again of a government salary or wage. Once the ID system gets linked, and I do a digital, of my thumbprint, then we'll replace the ID. The physical attendance register need not be manually entered into a digital form on a daily basis. Now you just get that information along with the time of when the person sort of entered. But I mean, unfortunately, if we don't have the ID system in place and out there, then we should look at other ways in which we can optimize. Is there another poll that we need to do, Nancy?
Yes, so we'll just finish the last two questions that we had. If you're done presenting, that is.
I'm done, Nancy.
Okay, so Doreen, please.
Sure. So the third question on the screen was, what are the critical use cases that would benefit most from a digital ID? So maybe the same way you voted, maybe you can just do for 3 and 4. We'll appreciate. We'll just give you 2 to 3 minutes to put your answers in. You can start with 3. What are the critical use cases that would benefit most from a digital ID? Scroll down and look at 3. So we have some feedback coming in there, maybe another 2 minutes for 3, then we can move to 4. Thank you, I can see they're increasing, yeah. I'll give you 2 minutes. Okay, let me take on question 3. So the one with the highest percentage.
I closed mine and it's not appearing any longer. The poll.
Sorry? Please speak up, sorry.
The poll is not appearing on my screen at all.
Is there anybody else who's facing the same challenge?
Though I closed it when I was trying to search for the subsequent question.
Let me read out the question. Let me read out the question for your benefit. So the question is, what are the critical use cases that would benefit most from a digital ID? So the first one that has gotten the most response is government transfers. That would be pensions, salaries, and wages. So a lot of the participants have voted for this at 63%. I am seeing social payments is actually higher at 68%. And then there is cash in, cash out. So there's social payments, government transfers, and then cash in, cash out. Maybe Nancy or any of the team members or the participants would like to make a comment around this?
Yes.
Yes, you can make a comment, or any of the participants, feel free.
Yeah, so it's interesting the responses that we are getting. You'll notice they're nearly matching with what we had suggested as our first phase use cases. So it shows that we are all aligned as what we need to be focusing on at this level in terms of use cases for the payments ecosystem, as well as in developing the digital ID. Yeah.
Thank you, Nancy, for that. Thank you. Any other comment? Okay, if there is no comment, we can move to the fourth one, which says, which of the two has a bigger stake in the development of a digital ID? So the one that gets the highest at 85% is the public sector. And then 85% of people voted for public sector and 20% voted for the private sector. Anyone who'd like to make a comment on this as well? All right. Okay, all right, no comment. So we only had those 4 questions for the polling session. Thank you very much for your participation and for the feedback. Over to you, Nancy, for the rest of the session.
Okay, thank you very much, Doreen. So now we'll just get into any questions that we may have for Venkat, and then immediately after that, we'll move into the action planning session. So anyone with a question, this would be a good time. Any comments, any feedback, we'll appreciate that. Venkat, I'll just ask you to begin the action planning session now, and then we'll move on, we'll move from there.
The action planning for us is more about how do we take this forward, and what is it that that needs to be prioritized. So obviously we started with a set of things that that need to be prioritized. Each of these, we obviously need to build a way of doing this, and the best way, in my view, would be to actually hear from participants as to how best or which are these use cases that we can prioritize, and what are the challenges that you foresee in each of these, in let's say in government payments, or be it in social benefit transfer.
If we may invite Ms. Saude to talk about how we can go about the digitization of G2P. Ms. Saude, please.
Yes, okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I think if I heard correctly, he was speaking about the challenges in terms of getting, digitizing social transfers. For me, the major challenge which I see is the lack of infrastructure across the state. Because the moment you digitize payments and people have to, either access their funds through financial institutions or digital systems, we have to look and see whether there's actual service network coverage in those areas, one, and if there are banking services or even, what do you call them, the payment service providers or that are available in those communities. What we see for most of the cash transfer beneficiaries is that they're really hard to reach areas where there is a dearth of electricity, telephones, and even banking services. So for me, that's the greatest challenge. I think if we have the infrastructure sorted out, every other thing, we can get them on board. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Saude. I think it's an important point. Maybe if I may request Mr. Ilukwe to talk about the infrastructure issues and what are the larger plans that the state has.
Thank you, Anu. Well, what the state is doing at the moment, yes, the infrastructure issue, of course, it's a key building block for all this to come through in terms of financial inclusion as well as the digital identity. What we're trying to do essentially is to work in partnership with the private sector, with private infrastructure providers, by giving financial and other initiatives for them to roll out networks. 2 weeks ago, thereabouts, I mean, the biggest network operator in the country is MTN, that has 52% of the network of the market. And then the biggest infrastructure provider in the country is IHS, that they build about 80% or thereabouts of the network infrastructure in terms of the base stations. And so we're talking actively to both of them. With IHS is the pass-through to coordinate between themselves, MTN and Airtel. And we've offered them incentives to be able to build out, the base stations, which the network operators will now use to extend their networks. And these are going to be cash and in-kind incentives, like land, certificates of occupancy. With MTN, we've spoken to them. They already have a commitment on their own that the whole of the country, and of course, Kaduna, we're talking to them to focus on Kaduna in terms of priority, would be 3G, which will enable data to go nationwide. So as far as that goes, that's primarily what we're doing. And of course, at the back end, we're building out our identity infrastructure, which I wanted to ask you, because most of the examples you gave were of national identity platforms. We are subnational government, and we're trying to be able to deploy in partnership with NIMSI, but we didn't really hear too much about that kind of example. So I've answered your question, and maybe I hope I have, and if you can speak to that, thank you.
To add more to that, the challenges you talked about. Yes, the infrastructure is there. like so they said, and Gerald as well. So of course there are plans to address those gaps. Again, we'll also have to look at the issues of the portable devices that would be used, and then are they actually user-friendly applications? How do we plan to address language barriers? And would the applications be simple and easy to use and understand for the users? Then of course, what incentives are we planning for people to buy into the idea? Those are things that we also need to look at as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great comments and inputs. And I think on the identity aspect, I think that as much as we are collaborating with NIMC, we have to really understand how the whole foundational identity play is going to work, and then what would be the coordination, because we don't want to end up in a situation where there exist two databases, and if a person moves from, say, Kaduna to Lagos for work or whatever, and has changes in the details, it is not adequately captured in one database or the other. Okay. Any other point around the identity issue? And or the potential use cases?
I also wanted to, can you hear me? I also wanted to, at the beginning, you had the 4 building blocks, if you will call them that. And I was trying to get some clarity around the building block in terms of the, like the use case. And then I think it was between, you had 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, between 4 and 2 or 4 and 1. Yeah, that one.
So,
no, 4 and 2, 4 and 2, yes.
On 2, I think we have a separate session anyway on public finance and public finance management and those aspects. But essentially, 4 was the biometric identity database, which is more a foundation one. Payment infrastructure.
Okay, let me.
Yes.
Sorry, let me just try and be clear. For example, here on 4, you said program-specific database for health, pension, wages, etc. So let's take a look at wages. Okay. So the payment-specific database for wages is the personnel application. Is that correct?
Is that the case in Kaduna?
Yeah, for wages, for public servants' wages.
Okay.
Yeah, it's we have a payroll. We have a platform, an application called the HR application. And
sure.
Then,
so that would become, yes, that would be the program database for wages. Yes.
Then you're talking about the public finance infrastructure. So that's what I'm trying. That's the public finance financial management application. So
those would be the GFMS systems. So you would have a GFMS which does budgeting, planning for the year, how much each line department gets, how that money is transferred. So and then and the accounting of that money, the expenditure that is booked against that money or that budget that has been made.
Yes.
So that would fall under this category, sir.
Yeah. So from the context of identity and the functional case, which is wage disbursement.
Could you repeat the whiches?
I said from the functional point of view, okay, the 4 and the 2 would actually sit within an ERP as different modules.
Oh, that way. See, I think 2 would sit most likely with Department of Finance,
yes,
with other departments having logins. So say, for example, a system where expenditure management needs to happen, individual departments, have to book their expenditure against this particular system. So that would reside actually within with finance. The finance would be the responsible for it, whereas other people would be using that system. For me, the program database is slightly more a line department. So say, for example, if I'm having a farmer's database, a farmer's registry, that would lie with the Ministry of Agriculture and the department under it. Now, wages is a slightly tricky because government wages is paid by finance. And typically that is a module, as you said, and very rightly pointed out, a module within the public finance management system would have an HR module. And that module would make payments for wages of government employees. But for that use case, the program database would be nothing but a module within the IFMIS or the GFMS system that you call it, the Integrated Financial Management Information System, the ERP that is used for your financial transactions. But for other cases like beneficiary related aspects, you would need a separate program database.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to clear that. Thank you.
Okay, great. I think considering that we are slightly above the time allocated for this, if there are no further questions or any further discussions that the participants would want us to focus upon, maybe we can close the session. And we'll share our email IDs as we share this deck with you. We'll share our email IDs in case if you have any questions which you would want to ask us, or if you want to have a separate discussion, we are very happy to facilitate that as well. Thank you so very much for all your patience amid the technological hiccups that we faced. Hopefully in the next workshop, we'll not face these kind of challenges. We will be sending the pre-read deck for the next workshop, which would be on public finance management systems. Over to you, Nancy Doreen, for the next steps.
So thank you everyone for your participation in the call. I hope this has been useful and it's something that will be easily applied to your day-to-day operations. If you have any questions,